on the Wiki Van.
In Colonial, New England, a mother is kidnapped. Her newborn daughter is ripped from her arms. But she perseveres. She gets revenge. And eventually, she makes her way back home. Colonial America often inspires thoughts of beautiful gardens in Williamsburg or cobblestone streets in Boston or Philadelphia. But in 1697, life in colonial New England wasn't quite that charming. At that time, life was difficult, it was dirty, and it was fraught with danger. At that time, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was still new. Its residents were only a couple generations removed from the Pilgrims landing in Plymouth. Nobody knew just yet what was to become of this new world, but everyone did seem to be fighting for whatever their particular vision of its future was. Hannah and Thomas Duston lived in a village called Haverhill in Massachusetts. They were about 30 miles north of Boston, which at that time meant they were living on the true frontier. Their farm was slipshod, dotted with apple trees and bean crops, and had fences and some small sheds made just from whatever trees happened to be nearby. Their log house wasn't precise or symmetrical. The focus for colonial New England families was on simplicity and function. By March 15th of 1697, Hannah and Thomas had been married for about 20 years. Hannah was 39 years old and Thomas was just a few years older than her. They had 8 children. Their oldest was a daughter. She was 18 years old, and their youngest, another daughter, who they named Martha, was born only 6 days earlier. 17th century colonial life required strength and resilience. The reward for endless manual labor was simply having enough to eat. For them and everyone at that time, death was a much more present part of life. In fact, the Dustons had already lost 4 children at very young ages, and that was just about average for a New England frontier family. So that meant that 6-day-old infant, Martha, was Hannah's 12th delivery. And all seemed well with Martha. The baby was healthy and happy. But the delivery was a particularly difficult one for Hannah. Hannah had been confined to her bed for the entire 6-day period following Martha's birth. Customarily, childbirth took place in the mother's home, with a midwife attending. There were 3 general expectations for being a midwife in 17th century New England. First, the midwife had to be female. Second, the midwife needed to be a bit older with some experience. And third, the midwife had to live nearby. The 50-year-old widow named Mary Neff satisfied all 3 of those expectations. Hannah referred to Mary as her nurse. And Nurse Mary appeared to be wholly dedicated to Hannah and Martha. In fact, Mary had moved into the Duston house and lived with them for the entire 6-day period. She helped take care of the baby Martha and helped take care of Hannah as she rested and tried to regain her strength. On that morning, March 15th, 1697, Thomas Duston and the other 7 Duston children were all already up and outside of the house. The Puritan work ethic demanded that these colonial farming families rise with the sun. They were all either working or playing and kind of scattered around the grounds of the farm. But The circumstances of Martha's birth and of Hannah's weakness meant that 3 people remained inside the Duston house that morning: bedridden Hannah, Nurse Mary, and the infant Martha. They were all confined indoors, which meant they would be unable to see or hear any potential approaching danger. By the end of the 17th century, both the English and the French had become experts at finding good enough reasons why the other should die. That French settlers in Canada were Catholic and New Englanders were Protestant Puritans was itself sufficient justification for either of them. But they also both had their eyes on the same land, hoping to expand their holdings on New England and New France. And, of course, various American Indian tribes knew well the seemingly instinctual tendency to fight for land, defend land, and seek power, control, and wealth. All 3, the English, French, and Indians, provoked fear and violence, and too often it was the more innocent among them who became caught in the middle of it all. Leading up to 1697, the French had been considerably more successful both at converting Indians to Catholicism and at establishing military alliances with Indians. The tribes in the region often found French settlers to be less invasive. French settlers in North America were more likely to be single men. Most of them were seeking fortune in fur trapping, which meant they lived in the woods and they lived alone and they just moved around a lot more. The English settlers, on the other hand, were always large families and living on working farms. They just took up a lot more land. The French also engaged in more trade with the Indians. Sometimes those single French fur trappers even traded for young women, essentially buying wives from Indian fathers. And that practice of buying and selling women even expanded to English women, most often after they were captured in raids on New England villages. By the late 1600s, the French started to solicit their Indian allies' brave warriors in a new and very effective way, and that was by offering cash payments for English scalps. The Abenaki were, and still are, proud people, and among the Abenaki then, the French found many willing, fierce, and capable warriors. The Abenaki could deliver dozens of English scalps to the French after each of their raids on New England settlements. And it didn't take long before the Abenaki realized the French would pay even more for English women and children if they could be taken captive. The French alliances and their payments for English scalps led to dozens of Indian raids on English villages and farms. The raids became just one more danger that New England farming families had to accept as a fact of life. They all knew an Indian raid could come at any time. English farmers and villagers prepared for these attacks by systematically scattering garrison houses in and around their villages. Generally, a garrison house was a 2-story fortified structure. They held weapons and rations and were a general place of refuge in the event of an attack. The houses actually worked quite well at saving the lives of people under attack if the people had time to run to one and hide. In Haverhill, the garrison house was strategically situated on the high ground. It wasn't too far from the Duston farm, but a retreat in that direction meant a bit of a climb uphill. English families taught their children and always kept in the backs of their minds that at the first sight of an Indian attack. Immediately, drop what you're doing and run. Run to the garrison house. On the morning of March 15th, 1697, unbeknownst to the Dustons or anyone else in Haverhill, there were about 30 stout Abenaki warriors, neatly hidden among the trees and the wilderness brush that surrounded the village. Recall, Thomas and 7 of the Duston children were all already up and outside of the house. Hannah, Nurse Mary, and the infant, Martha, remained inside the house. The attack on Haverhill started just after dawn that morning. The villagers heard the impending attack before they saw anything. The Abenaki always led with their war cries. Shortly after, the villagers' eyes filled with terror. The Abenaki wore either no clothing or very little. They adorned their faces and bodies with dyes and war paints. Some of the Abenaki wore belts or necklaces which were strung with the scalps of their previous kills. As they ran toward the villagers, they carried and held high their weapons. They wielded hatchets and clubs, and some even had guns. Upon seeing and hearing the attack, calls of alarm were sounded all over Haverhill. There were screams and yells that everyone should run to the garrison house. Thomas was either lucky or smartly prepared. He had his gun and his horse nearby. He quickly grabbed his gun and jumped onto the back of his horse. He then tried to simultaneously find and gather his 7 children and direct them to safety. Haverhill fell into utter chaos. It was consumed by a tumultuous combination of disorganized sounds. The Abenaki war cries, the voices of the villagers screaming and warning each other as they tried to run to safety. There was a quick commencement of gunshots from both sides, and, of course, the sounds of people being hatcheted to death. Among the chaos, Thomas attempted to account for each one of his 7 children. He called and shouted with all he had, directing them to run as fast as they could, run to the garrison house. Then Thomas remembered his wife, his only 6-day-old daughter, and their nurse. All 3 of them were still cooped up inside the house. Could they even hear what was happening? Thomas thought he had to try to save them, but the problem was the Duston's house was at the bottom of a slight but steady hill, and the garrison house was at the top of that hill. But Thomas turned and he drove his horse down the hill and toward their home. His children were now behind him, struggling up the hill toward the garrison house. Thomas was facing his own house. He knew his wife and daughter were inside. And to his dismay, he could see there were several Abenaki just outside of the house. They were ready to break in. Behind him, his 7 children were still running as fast as they could. They were running for their lives. They helped and carried each other along the way. The youngest of them was still barely old enough to walk. Thomas simply had no choice. The Abenaki were too close to the house. So Thomas turned his horse around and he focused his attention on the children running up the hill. Momentarily, he thought he'd have to choose only one child to save, but it was too difficult a choice for a father to make, and he had already given up on his house and his wife and his newborn daughter. Thomas decided if any of these children were going to die that day, he was going to die with them. So he rode, and he positioned his horse between his children and the pursuing Abenaki. His attention was drawn back and forth. He looked back and continued encouraging his children up the hill. Then he turned and faced the other direction toward the Abenaki, who continued to pursue them all. He stayed behind his kids, and he stopped several times to fire his gun, hoping he could keep the Abenaki
at bay. Later, it was described as being by the singular providence of God. Thomas and all 7 children made it to the safety of the garrison house. They were all safe. To them, it was a miracle. But when those 8 Dustons turned and looked back down the hill toward the village that the garrison house overlooked, all they could see was death and destruction. Bodies littered the hill, and they soon realized Hannah, Mary, and Martha were nowhere to be seen. They saw that there were 6 homes in Haverhill that were now engulfed in flames, and the Dustons soon realized their house was one of them. The Duston house was burning to the ground.
The truth is, Hannah didn't stand a chance. She had been in bed for 6 straight days. And as for Nurse Mary and baby Martha, being indoors sealed their fates as well.
Mary did say that she made an attempt to cover the baby and dash for the door, but the Abenaki grabbed her before she even made it through the doorway. Hannah was still in her bed when the Abenaki broke into the house. She jumped up quickly when she realized that they had broken in, but at that point, she was all alone in the house. She did say that she tried to kind of hide herself along a single strong stone wall, the wall in her house that made up the chimney, but it was no use. At that moment, Hannah assumed that they were just going to go ahead and kill her right then and there. She was sure that that was the moment that she was going to die. But she was wrong. First, they were more interested in rifling through all of their things, and Hannah watched as they either took or destroyed everything she owned. Then they ushered her outside, and she watched as they set fire to her little house. Outside, the Indians quickly gathered together and prepared to retreat. And that's when Hannah saw Mary and Martha. They were alive. Then the Indians surrounded the 3 of them and about 10 other villagers from Haverhill. The attack began quickly and it ended quickly. Hannah, Mary, and Martha, along with some neighbors, had been taken captive. Hannah had no idea if her husband or any of her other children had survived the attack. But now she was being poked and prodded on a forced march into the wilderness. Her initial thoughts were quite hopeful. She felt certain the English would quickly organize a militia and come to her rescue. At least, she thought, they would begin negotiating some sort of ransom payment. Either way, she had hoped that they would all soon be freed. So she followed directions and followed her captors. The Abenaki, too, had thoughts that an English militia might quickly come after them. Therefore, their goal was to travel as far as possible and to do so quickly and quietly. There was no talking allowed. The Abenaki didn't even talk to each other. They went into the deep wilderness. They stayed well clear of any other English settlements.
In the matter of a single morning, Hannah had been ripped from her bed and from her home. She had watched as all of her worldly possessions were either stolen or destroyed. She had been taken captive along with her nurse and her newborn daughter, and she had seen her house burned to the ground. She still had no idea if her husband or any of her 7 other children were even alive. But for Hannah Duston, the worst was yet to come.
Walking through the wilderness both quickly and quietly is not exactly an easy task for a 6-day-old infant. The exact reason is unknown, and it's unknown if it was Mary or Hannah who was holding Martha. Likely, the infant Martha was making too much noise or slowing the pace of the march. But shortly after the march began, one of the Abenaki snatched the baby away from the women.
Before either Hannah or Mary could even try to stop him, he grabbed the baby by her feet and whipped her small body against the trunk of a nearby tree. Hannah later described it by saying, "Her brains were dashed out of her head." They still did not stop. The captors demanded that they continue marching at a grueling pace. If any of the captives were not able to keep up, then, to the Abenaki, they weren't worth keeping. Hannah and Mary watched as several other captives were killed. If they slowed to think or pray or from exhaustion, they quickly received a hatchet to the head. As Hannah reported it, after her neighbors were killed, their bodies were then left for the beasts and the birds to feed upon. They were walking northward in mid March. The ground was still scattered with patches of snow. They walked for days and days, and the days turned into a week, and they continued northward. The women had nearly nothing to eat over the course of those days. But somehow, both Hannah and Mary were able to keep the pace, which kept them alive. Over time, the captors became more relaxed. More distance between them and the English meant less chance of a pursuing militia. Of course, for the captives, this meant there was less chance that anyone was coming to save them. It went on that way for a couple weeks until they all reached a spot just north of present day Concord, New Hampshire. Here, things changed considerably. They came upon various other Indians. These were not the youthful or strongest warrior type of Indians who had taken the villagers captive. These were more like elder males. They took some time to discuss things with the warriors, and somehow they came to make claims upon particular captives. It's unclear exactly how all of this worked. Maybe they paid the warriors, or maybe they had some previous agreement, or maybe there was some other reasoning.
Hannah referred to the Indian who laid his claim upon her as her new master. It's difficult to describe any part of Hannah's ordeal as lucky, but considering the circumstances, it must have come as quite a relief that this new master also laid a claim upon Mary. Now, the warriors who attacked Haverhill had seemingly completed their mission, and they all went their separate ways. The other captives, who were similarly claimed by other new masters, were likewise taken and went separate ways. Hannah and Mary, though, stayed together. Their new master held them captive now, and he first took them to meet what Hannah referred to as his family. His family consisted of 2 men, 3 women, and 7 children. And there was one other person in this family. It was a young boy. He appeared to be about 13 years old. And to the women's great surprise, he was English. He soon told Hannah and Mary that his name was Samuel Leonardson. He explained to them that his family lived on a farm in Worcester, in Massachusetts, and that one day his village was attacked by Indians. During the attack, he was kidnapped and was later claimed by the leader of this family. And he also told them he had been living with the Indians now for over a year and a half.
In that time, Sam was able to learn a good deal of the Indians' language. He even helped the master learn some English. And very importantly, he was also able to help Hannah and Mary find food, which they desperately needed.
The surroundings and people had considerably changed, but after this transition, they still continued moving northward. Although now it was more at a family's pace than a warrior's. Along the way, Hannah noticed that her master obliged the children in his family to say prayers before each meal and before they slept. And she heard the prayers were being recited in Latin. To her, it was obvious now. They were saying Catholic prayers. Her master was under the influence of the French. And that meant he most likely intended to take the women to Canada and sell them as slaves to the French. Indeed, there were European slaves bought and sold in North America during the colonial period. They were mainly English women, and they were traded among the Indians and the French. There were times along the way that the women communicated at least a little bit with the master, although he was not always kind to them. Sometimes he said things or treated them in a manner that was to ridicule or condescend them, or even try to terrify them. He mocked them whenever they stopped to pray, and he once insolently demonstrated with a hatchet his particular technique for extracting the scalps of Englishmen who he had previously killed. But what terrified Hannah most was when he told the women about something that was going to happen to them soon.
The master told the women that soon they would all come to a large Indian village, and when they arrived, the women would be welcomed just as all new English visitors were welcomed. That is, Hannah and Mary would be forced to run the gauntlet.
He told them this meant they would first be stripped naked. Then an army of Indians would form long, straight lines on two sides, and each person on the line would be holding some sort of club or stick. Then the women would be forced to run from the beginning to the end of the line, all the way down, being flogged and battered. What's more, the entire village would attend the spectacle, and as they watched, they would all be calling out jeers and insults. For the Indians, this was usually used as a test of their prisoners' fortitude, but apparently it was also something they found entertaining. What the master didn't know at that time, though, was that in trying to scare Hannah, he was actually making Hannah feel as though she had nothing else to lose, and he was fueling in her more and more thoughts of revenge and escape. Hannah started secretly conspiring with Mary and Sam. She told them she thought the three of them could escape. They could kill everyone in the Indian family and save themselves. Soon, the whole party arrived in a place near present-day Boscawen, a small town in New Hampshire. For a while, they had been walking along the Merrimack River, and they reached a point where there was a little river island that protruded from the middle of the river. The island made a good place for everyone to sleep, and it was decided that they would use it as a campsite for a while. Hannah knew this is where it had to happen. The island was the best chance they'd have to escape. More importantly, Hannah knew the Merrimack River. She knew that eventually this river meandered south directly and all the way back to Haverhill, Massachusetts. They could follow the river all the way home. Also, the island meant they'd all be sleeping together, all near each other. Mary and Sam agreed, and the next night, in the very early morning, after everyone in the family was sleeping deeply, they took action. Hannah, Mary, and Sam each quietly took a hatchet from the master's tools. Then, these 3 English captives began. Their time and place was fraught with violence. They had all been first-hand witnesses. Now, they all became practitioners of what they had only previously witnessed. In another time and place, their acquaintance with these Indians might have been more charming, but the nature of humanity prevented it in this time and at this place. Surely Hannah was thinking about her family and her infant daughter Martha and Haverhill, and she and Mary and Sam rendered their freedom. One of the Indian boys escaped the English throes and ran out into the wilderness, and one of the women, although injured, was also able to escape. But also, within just minutes, 10 Abenaki Indians, including the master, had been killed. And for the first time in weeks, Hannah, Mary, and Sam were no longer held captive. The 3 of them then took one of the camp's canoes and started paddling southward. Hannah didn't feel free just yet. They were still in Indian territory. Being seen or heard could mean a return to captivity. So they quietly traveled downriver, only in darkness, over the course of several days. Eventually, near the present-day town of Nashua, New Hampshire, they saw what they knew was an English farm. It was owned by a man named John Lovewell. Hannah, Mary, and Sam stayed at John Lovewell's farm that night. They all talked and they agreed the river was still their fastest and easiest route back to Haverhill in Massachusetts. They continued in their canoe the next day, and soon they arrived home. When they got close to Haverhill, they abandoned the canoe. They wanted to walk back into the town on foot. On that day, Thomas and the 7 remaining Duston children learned that their mother and wife was still alive. And Hannah Duston learned she didn't have to mourn any more of her children. Hannah was reunited with her family. Mary Neff was reunited with her village and her adult children. Sam Leonardson found out his mother had died and his father had moved to Connecticut. Sam stayed in Haverhill for a few days, and once his father was found, arrangements were made for him to travel to Connecticut, where they were reunited.
As word spread around New England of this incredible story, people responded by sending all kinds of notes and gifts to the Dustons.
Cotton Mather, the most famous Puritan preacher in Boston, gave a sermon shortly after her return, which he dedicated to Hannah Duston. Later, he interviewed her and published a narrative of her experience. Mather titled the narrative Dox Femina Facti, which means a woman led the deed. Upon returning home, Sam was on the verge of adulthood. He got married only a few years later. He and his wife had 5 children, and they continued living in Connecticut.
Sam died when he was fairly young, in 1718. He was only about 35 years old. The exact circumstances of his death are unknown. It was said that after Sam returned to New England, he chose not to record or even discuss anything about his time in captivity or his escape. with Hannah and Mary.
Mary Neff lived the rest of her life in Massachusetts. She died in 1722, somewhere near the age of 75. Hannah returned to her family, and they seem to have picked up right where they left off. She and Thomas even had one more child. It was a daughter named Lydia. She was born in October of 1798, and at the time of Lydia's birth, Hannah was over 40 years old. After the Indian raid, Thomas built his family a new 2-story brick house. Now, the Duston's house was itself a garrison house. And that house is still standing in Haverhill today. It's even occasionally open to the public. The conflict between the English and the French and the diverse Indians in New England and Canada was not even close to over. After the 1697 Indian raid, the village of Haverhill was similarly attacked in 1704, and again in 1707, and again in 1708. The Dustons did remain living in Haverhill, but they did not endure any more losses to death or kidnapping during any of those attacks. Thomas Duston lived another 27 years. He died in 1724, somewhere near the age of 72. Hannah lived another 40 years following her captivity. The exact date of her death is unknown. It was either 1736 or 1737. Hannah Duston lived to be nearly 80 years old.
Many years later, in 1874, Hannah Duston became the first female in American history to have a publicly funded memorial dedicated in her honor. You can see it here behind me. It was erected in Boscawen in New Hampshire, the location where Hannah and Mary and Sam began their escape. This is that Little River Island. It seems so peaceful now. It's hard to imagine the brutality it once witnessed so many years ago. But it's important for history to remember all of the experiences of the past. And it seems fitting that in this location, it's as if Hannah Duston herself remains to ensure that her story is not forgotten. Elbow.